student assessment, why and how, with particular attention to the possibilities offered or created by modern technology. This topic was chosen before the pandemic, before the lockdown, and surprisingly, it became suddenly very timely, even urgent in 2020 and 21, caused by the sanitary condition and the lockdowns. However, the same condition obliged us to cancel the Ethical Forum in December 2020 as a live event, and we decided at that time not to organize it online because the Ethical Forum is a typical live event, and we decided to organize it in 2021 with the same topic, the same speakers, the same format. But again, the same conditions made the live event even in December 2021 undesirable, even if not impossible, and hence we had to decide to organize it in an online format today. As chairman of the University Foundation, I thank the members of the organizing committee for their cooperation, and in particular, the coordinator of the present edition of the Ethical Forum, Professor Jean-Paul Lambert, who had to change the organization over and over again. I thank the speakers for their flexibility and their willingness to contribute, and I thank all participants for their interest. I will leave the floor to Jean-Paul Lambert for introducing the topic, the program, and the speakers, and I wish you all a fruitful and interesting afternoon, and I hope that our next Ethical Forum in December 2022 will be a live event on a topic which the organizing committee will choose with much wisdom. Jean-Paul, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all the participants who have joined us this afternoon and to convey our warm thanks to the speakers who have accepted our invitation and remain committed despite the changes occurring as well in the date as in the form. The President has reminded us of all the changes which are reflected, in fact, in the presentation of the theme on the website. It was drafted prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, hence the absence of any mention to at-distance assessment, except for a small sentence added later on at the end of the text. I suspect that the speakers and participants will also wish to raise this issue at the forum. Since we have a rich program this afternoon, I will keep to these short introductions, so let's go on with the program. Let's now first listen to the 3 background addresses, each one not to be exceeding 20 minutes and, if possible, a bit less. The first one, prepared in collaboration with Professor Pascal Detraux, will be presented jointly by Mr. Mathieu Hausmann and Dr. Laurent Leduc from Université de Liège, who are specialists in higher education pedagogy. Their communication is entitled Learning Analytics at the Bedside of a Seriously Ill Patient Called Assessment. Mr. Hausmann and Leduc, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. During this first speech, my colleague Mathieu and I will have a look at the strength and the potential weaknesses of assessment in higher education, starting with the challenges met by assessment in this field, And then we'll discuss the assets of learning analytics and whether they could bring some kind of solutions to the weaknesses of assessment. Next slide, please. Yeah, let's start with some insight about this notion of assessment, which is coming from the literature. In a very well-known definition of this concept, Stuffelbeam states that the primary function of assessment are to take a measure of a given performance, to facilitate judgment about that performance, and to make a decision about it. And as you'll see, these three components will be put into perspective with those of learning analytics later in the presentations. Next slide, please. Now we'll have a closer look to this notion in order to understand what can be wrong with assessment in higher education. Assessment can be schematized with the following model. So we have a student here on the left, and we'd like to measure her cognitive knowledge, skills, or even competencies. But in order to do that, we do not have a direct assessment tool, such as a scale, for instance, which we use to weigh ourselves. Unfortunately, we are forced to resort to an artifact, an examination or an assessment device. In short, something that we put in place to have access to these learning outcomes that we cannot assess with a perfect instrument. And this artifact must have a number of qualities, mainly in terms of content validity or construct validity. Once this assessment device has been designed, the student comes and performs according to this artifact, meaning that she will answer to the question you've asked or will realize the assignment you've required, and this will lead to a score. Indeed, you're going to evaluate and score the performance of the student, and finally you will infer from this score related to the performance and according to the artifact that that student is actually competent or not, that the student has met the targeted learning outcomes or not. The problem, actually there are several problems. The problem is there are various measurement errors that we'll have to deal with. First, the artifact does not always exactly covers all the learning outcomes that it should cover. There can be problems of content validity or construct validity. Secondly, student performance will depend on many factors, some of them being very well known in the literature, like stress, tiredness, like student being uncomfortable with specific assessment modes like MCQs, for example. And these elements come into play and can literally skew the performance of the student. And finally, when it comes to scoring, grading, it appears that the human being is not a good evaluator. So there can be problems of fidelity as well. So the main challenge of assessment is to ensure that the quality of the measurement is optimized. However, the transition from the learning outcomes to be measured to the artifact, this is step one. From the learning to the performance, this is step two. And from the performance to the scoring, this is step three, is fraught with errors that make the transition from the scoring to the assessment of the knowledge, skill, and competencies quite uncertain. Next slide, please. So there are ways to deal with that. Critical dot simology and the science of examinations provides a number of principles to be observed. This is what assessment needs to be efficient. First, assessment needs quality assessment tools. The quality of the measurement is mainly ensured by the quality of the assessment procedure. This validity relates to the content or the response process, the internal structure of the test, the relationship with other variables, and the consequences of the test. Number two, triangulation of data, which includes multiple opportunities for assessment, and the idea of diversification of assessment modalities. Indeed, when you can get a perfect measurement in the first place, well, you can try to multiply the data collect so that the quality for some compensate for the shortcomings of others. What we also know in the field of evaluation is that it is necessary to diversify the methods of assessments. For instance, MCQs are great for evaluating knowledge, but if you target higher taxonomic levels like analysis or synthesis, you'll have to switch to another assessment mode. And finally here, assessment needs to also have a positive impact on learning. That's what David Nichols says when he describes his 12 principles of good assessment and feedback, and especially his principle number 5. Because beyond assessment of learning, there is assessment for learning. The aim are to foster self-assessment and reflection, to deal actively with feedback, and to provide teachers with information that can help them shape their teaching. Just a remark here, as you can see on this slide, we've used color codes for each of these 4 recommendations. You'll see those codes again later on. Next slide, please. So we wonder what is the situation, in our case, in the French-speaking area of Belgium. So we'll see in those, if those 4 pieces of advice are actually applied by teachers here in higher education. For that, we'll turn to the second edition of a research report led by Professor Pascal Detro and Professor Marc Romainville. This is a research from 2017 aiming to understand how and why teachers assess the learning outcomes of students in higher education in this part of our country. This research had a quantitative side with 2,292 teachers having answered the survey, and also a qualitative side with 37 semi-structured interviewed. So we have here robust data on what is really going on in terms of assessment in higher education according to these 4 assessment needs or recommendations. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now let's have a look at some interesting results. On the upper left table, we can see that a high percentage of teachers, actually more than 50% in university, only assess their student during the course exam at the end of the term. Thus, in those cases, the logic of multiple opportunities for assessment throughout the term is not applied. And now if we look at the exams on the other table and look how diversified the assessment modalities are, which was the second recommendations, we're dealing with the triangulation of data, we can see that the written exam remains the norm with 68% in university and 69% higher in haute école. The preferred method of assessment appears to be clearly the written exams, and as the only method of assessment in those cases. Next slide, please. And if we look at those written examinations, we can see here in red that most teachers only give the grade to their students as a feedback, thus making weak the likelihood to foster a positive impact on learning of their assessment. The best practices, the one which are known as the best one, like individualized specific feedback with suggestion for improvements, feed forward, these kind of things, which are typical of assessment for learning, are still very much in the minority in green. Next slide, please. Thank you. So overall, what does the survey reveal about the quality of assessment? It reveals that the quality of evaluation in higher education is really questionable. Triangulation of information is not particularly applied. The validity of assessment procedures suffers from various biases that limit the quality of the measurement in the oral exams, in open questions, for instance. And finally, the actual feedback does not seem to be able to support student self-regulation. We can notice here, based on the interview with a sample of teachers, that the size of the group and the time available to allocate to student assessment are the 2 determining variables in teacher's choice. And also that standardized tests become prevalent above 125 students. Next slide, please. However, it's important to note that teachers are obviously concerned about the quality of assessment practices. Higher education teachers in the French-speaking area of Belgium want to do well, as the report shows too. You have this sentence here. Teachers are concerned with constructive, fair, equitable, valid, and reliable assessments. And indeed, we can see that almost 60% of the teachers answering the survey agree with the idea that assessment is an integral part of the teaching learning process. And more than 90% agree, and this is the blue line, agree with the idea that one of the goals of assessment is to facilitate the students' progress during the learning process. So we can wonder why most of them do not always apply the assessment principle we are discussing here. And I give the floor to Mathieu.
Well, thank you, Laurent. I just want to be sure that everyone can hear me. Yeah, okay, thank you. So as we have seen, university teachers feel like the context does not help them to produce quality assessments. But what if the context is both the problem and the solution? Here we can highlight 3 main trends in higher education. First, the student transformation characterized by massification, heterogeneity of capabilities and needs, and the fact that today's students are used to multiple devices that feed the big data and quantified self-movement. Secondly, access to knowledge has changed. Everything or nearly is on the internet now, so we can learn from multiple sources. And third, The education landscape has changed as well. We can find a lot more of technology in education setting, even more since the pandemic with distance learning or blended learning. But there is also some pressure on universities with an increase in competition between institutions and a form of management by results that pushes teachers and researchers to produce evidence of effectiveness. Nevertheless, the evolution of this context, and especially the massification of students, the increased use of digital tools and the data they produce in the whole society has fostered the emergence of learning analytics. So, according to the famous definition by Long and Siemens a decade ago, learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their context for the purpose of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. And interestingly, we can note that the definition of learning analytics fits pretty well with the one of assessment and his main functions. For example, the measure refers to the processing of data about learners' activities. The judgment refers to the understanding, and the appreciation of the quality of learning process. And the decisions are linked to the optimization of different aspects of learning activities and environment. There are four main functions of learning analytics that relate to different timescales and answer different questions, as you can see on the left side of the screen. The first one is maybe the more simple. It's the descriptive function that answers the question of what happened. The second one is the diagnostic function that answers the question of why did it happen. The third one is the predictive function with the question of what will happen, especially if nothing's changed. And the last one is maybe the most challenging, is the prescriptive function that answers to the question of how can we make it happen or avoid it, depending of the balance of the outcome. And on the right side, of the screen, there are the main applications of learning analytics approaches, which are visualization of indicators through dashboards, early alert systems and identification of students at risk, provision of recommendation and advices, but there are also the provision of learning paths in order to offer some adaptive learning to students. And nevertheless, there are some information that can help teachers to modify the design of their courses. So the cycle of learning analytics. Learning analytics operates in a cyclical way. In here, students carry out learning activities in their learning environments, and by doing so, they produce digital footprints at the same time. These data are then collected from the learning management system or the personal learning environment, and then processed by algorithm and converted into relevant indicators presented in a dashboard. Dashboards frequently allow learners to get feedback at a glance on their engagement in various tasks, for instance. However, this feedback can still be determined by the teacher who is careful to identify information about supporting learners' progress. So, as we can see, there are some new insights for a teacher that were not accessible in the past. And as we can see, learning analytics is more about supporting stakeholders than provide automatic decisions or recommendations. Learning analytics bring also some expectations for the field of assessment. The first one is the objectivity of data. According to Simon Buckinghamshire from Australia, learning analytics, with its ability to track so many more variables than traditional assessment, seems to be an exciting opportunity to shift practice and put it on a really firm empirical basis and evidence base. So, according to Mr. Buckinghamshire, the LA field provide an opportunity to reach more objectivity. And the data are said to be objective because they are factual with very little inference. So this gain in objectivity increases both validity and reliability of the measurement and the quality of the judgments and decisions in the assessment process. Next, the variety of data that learning analytics can process adds to the learning puzzle and allows us to see how the students are developing their skills rather than just whether they have developed them or not. This allows for the evolution of the students to be taken into account, and in doing so, triangulates the data available to assess their progress. And finally, it's maybe the point that we are the more concerned with, Laurent and I, it is the fact that we can expect more effective feedback because of the amount of information, the synthesis of multiple sources of information, the speed of data collection and processing, and the timeliness, the frequency of feedback and database recommendations. There is also important to note that learning analytics triggers or can trigger teachers' interventions according to CLAW, or learners' self-regulation according to some authors like Roll and Winnie or Lodge and colleagues. And finally, according to Knight, learning analytics can augment existing assessment structures through the augmentation of feedback process for effective assessment. So maybe the biggest impact of learning analytics is on the feedback process. Here we can see a model proposed by a team from the University of Leuven a few years ago. It is the learning analytics process model, and it's a kind of simplified but relevant version of the self-regulation processes described in the educational literature. And actually, there is a growing body of work that brings together experts from those fields in order to optimize the effectiveness of learning analytics approaches. And with respect to self-regulated literature, the benefit of LA is that it actively engages the student in the management of their learning, and digital tools are seen as an important asset in achieving this goal. Indeed, learning analytics seem to support learner engagement in processing the feedback provided within dashboard, even with large groups and on an ongoing basis. But there are also some concerns related to the field of learning analytics and some limitations regarding to the assessment field. Although learning analytics looks very promising, there are still some gray areas. There is a lot of factors, Laurent said it earlier, involved in learning, some internal, some external to students. And on the same hand, learning analytics doesn't allow for a global view on students' activity. So as Neil Selwyn, again from Australia, said in the LAC 18 conference, there are not enough data points in the world to adequately capture the complexities and nuances of who a student is. Moreover, there is also an ethical dimension to consider, with, for instance, a fear of data misinterpretation or misuse from teachers' perspective, and concerns about dependence on algorithms and loss of autonomy from learners' side. And so, as Skelter told us in his book of 2017, concerns about ethical issues have emerged as possibly the biggest barriers to the uptake of learning analytics in educational institutions. So there is a big part. There is also a need for a kind of data literacy in teachers' side, so they have to be able to process those data, to use them as information in order to help students and themselves with their learning environments. And there is also concern about the amount of information to be processed by students and the effect of those information, especially coming from the predictive or the prescriptive functions regarding to student motivation and persistence. So to conclude this presentation, but to pursue the reflection forward, we should say that we have tried to show from a theoretical point of view that learning analytics have the potential to improve the quality of assessment practice. It's a complex, but very promising issue. However, according to Weiberg's findings in 2018, empirical evidences of effectiveness and moreover on a large scale is still needed from the field of learning analytics. Most research has been done on small scale and frequently on a conceptual level. So it seems important to be concerned with the quality of students' interpretation of the information provided to them. And a big question that remains is how can we ensure that they are able to receive potentially discouraging information, interpret them properly, and find strategies for regulating their learning behavior. And we thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hosman and Leduc.
Well, let's present, I'm not doctor.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I hope so, but not actually.
Okay. Okay. So we will have time for questions, general discussion later, but I suggest we go to the second background address, which will be presented by Professor Martin Walke from Universiteit Ghent, who heads the Department of Education Studies and specializes in the innovation of higher education and the integrated use of ICT. His communication is entitled Recent Development in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, Making Exams Fair and Fit for Purpose. Professor Walke, it's up to you.
Thank you. You see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. There we go. First of all, can I really thank my colleagues from the Université de Liège for their also theoretical introduction to some key concepts. You helped me saving time today. And it also shows that we are in a way very congruent, because my first two bullets, I can really nearly throw them away. Because of course, key is that in higher education, we understand that assessment and evaluation really consists of these three different processes. They're different. So for instance, in Corona times, what do we change in higher education? Do we change the scoring, for instance? No. In fact, we will have to find new solutions for how we measure, how we determine the value of what was being measured, and the scoring discussion hardly, in fact, changes. So what will I do today? Well, I will look at these three steps and question, how can we really look for new ways of measuring? And our colleagues already showed something in that direction, new ways of determining value, and maybe also new ways of approaching scoring. Okay. Of course, they also showed us some evidence about what do we know about assessment and evaluation. And if you look at meta-analysis studies, and you want to know what in assessment and evaluation really contributes to learning performance of students, that then you will see that what really matters is feedback, formative evaluation, and involving students in questioning. So you don't see that the frequency of test taking and even teaching them how to take a test, it doesn't work that much. In fact, I agree completely with my colleagues that the feedback role of assessment and evaluation, that is at the core, okay? You also see, therefore, as they already stressed, that assessment is now seen as part of the teaching and the learning process. You move away from a sole focus on final assessment to a much more stronger emphasis on continuous assessment. You also move away from these low-level Bloom values focus in exams on simple objectives to complex objectives. So the key implications, what we learn from the literature, and you can simply go to our literature base to find research about this, because this is part of our research program in the field of innovation in higher education, is this change in the function of assessment and evaluation. And next one is a change in who has a key responsibility in this process, and also a key shift in the goals being assessed. So what I will discuss now is I will give you 4 examples that show you innovations in relation to the different parts of assessment and evaluation. And I will also show you how the role shifts and who has a key responsibility if learning is really at stake. I'm not talking about the administrative role and function of assessment and evaluation. So new roles, new techniques, and a shifting responsibility. And the examples I will give are all part of a big research program. We have lots of evidence to show you it works. It's not only appreciated, but it really has also a long-term impact on student performance. So, for instance, here, the shift from the teacher to peers and even to individual learners, this is also a major thing that is being discussed. Now, the first one. If you would look at this video clip, by the way, the presentation is available afterwards, you will see how this American colleague criticizes the quality of exam papers in higher education. And I didn't want to show you a video clip about the analysis of Flemish university level exams, but the result will be the same. It's a strong focus on lower levels in Bloom's taxonomy, really remembering some insight level, hardly application level, and certainly not analysis, evaluation, and creation, okay? So what you see is that we don't throw away a focus on, we have to assess foundation knowledge. I'm also responsible for bachelor level courses, so I need to assess large groups, 700, 800 students, but I move away in this research from these simple MC exams, multiple choice exams, to new types. And for instance, here you see this picture, and in this picture, you will see that the first part of the multiple choice exam is, in this case, something from the media. But it could also be from a research paper. It could be a calculation in a statistical analysis. And then we present, in fact, multiple choice items. And in our system, you always, depending on your answer, you will get, in fact, feedback. By the way, we completely moved also to video-based assessment. So the old way of thinking about multiple choice exam, that they are only able to help you to assess lower levels in understanding or in memory or in comprehension, is no longer the case. It all depends on the quality of what you present here at the start of a multiple choice, in fact, exam. And we see now with all these online assessment approaches that we present to students, that this is first of all highly appreciated, but also that we are really able to master, to assess the mastery of these higher level objectives. By the way, by developing these multiple choice exams, this new type, we embed them in the course. And for instance, in this pandemic, we now present to students, after every block, we present them self-assessment, multiple choice assessment exercises to introduce them this new way of looking at their mastery. And this really works, okay? Because something key is, yes, this key is that students, of course, have to get used to this new way of assessment. A second one, again, I moved to a large group assessment. It's, again, a first year course because I don't want to move to small group assessment. It's about 230 students. And these students also, next to an introduction to a strong theoretical base, they also have to learn about research and how about doing research. So what do they get? Online, by the way, they work in groups. They get a research article recently published, but without the abstract. So they can't find it, by the way, on the internet yet. Okay, so it's not online first yet. And they will work in a feedback, feed-forward cycle to give feedback to each other on the base of a new instrument. So you see, it's a change in the role of the assessment, a change in the responsibility, and a change in the tool. Okay, so they get, for instance, this article. By the way, we often use our own articles, but because it's in our own research domain. And then the students start, for instance, this student, by the way, this is a fictitious name, privacy, of course. They develop the first version of an abstract. They get peer feedback. On the base of the peer feedback, they write a new version of their abstract, and you see all the changes. And then they give feedback about the feedback, okay? And this is a very critical step. By the way, we are all researchers. This is the typical revision cycle with a rebuttal, okay? So we introduce them the criteria, and here you see it, they get criteria. There is also a code book with the criteria. And the first student, A, gives feedback to B, okay? B, in fact, B also gets feed forward, not only a critique, but also how could you make this better, okay? Then B improves the work and writes to A, okay? What did I do with your feedback, okay? And sometimes they neglect it and sometimes they accept it. So do you see? The feedback is not given here by the teacher. Of course, we monitor the feedback giving, but we give a responsibility to the students. So part of the assessment here is given to the students, and the aim is not to give a score. No, it's to involve students in assess your own work. Third example is in the veterinary sciences, where we all know the aim is in the end to have, well, vets that can function, for instance, in a surgery room. Well, we developed there a skills lab approach where students start working in what we call stations. And here you see the students working. And okay, I'm the proud owner of IKEA dogs, by the way. And then they have to do surgery or preparatory work to do surgery on these dogs. Well, in these stations, they exercise a core competence, but before they are allowed to enter the skills lab, they have to work online. They have to take online video-based courses with a self-test, and they need to reach a mastery of 90% in this prior assessment before they're allowed to the skills lab, okay? So they entered in the skills lab to carry out hands-on exercises. They work in couples, okay? And they have to evaluate their own work and the work of each other, okay? And they have to learn to follow these protocols, okay? We don't do the assessment ourselves. Of course, there is a specialist available in the room, monitor the work, but the students assess their own work, okay? So the quality control of their mastery of the competencies becomes part of their professional set of competences. Okay, we also assess this, and you clearly see that explained in comparison with a reference group in the prior year, that in fact there is a very strong increase, not only in self-efficacy of these students, but in fact in the mastery of the clinical competences. And then the last example is in fact about complex competences. I always say, well, in part, the job of many university professors is easy if you only stick to foundation knowledge. My main specialization is in the field of complex competences at the end of your university career. And for instance, consultation competences, how to deal with intimate partner violence, how to deal with aggression in certain situations. Because all knowledge domains have these complex competences. In this case, for instance, it's in a teacher training program. There, in fact, we have a very large variety of video clips. We enter these video clips in a learning environment where, when they run the video clip, at each step, they get questions, okay? They can reply to the questions and they get feedback. This allows us, in fact, to do very complex assessments of, in fact, well, of course, it's still not a real life situation. This is prior to internships. And by the way, also here, this is prior to the real work in a surgery room. Well, prior to them, that they already can exercise complex competences with feedback. We do that with up to 700-800 students at the same time, okay? But of course, when you want to do this, you will see that you will have to do, well, to develop all this material. So there is a set of also challenges linked to this. And this is one, it's teacher professional development. And simply, we neglect that assessment and evaluation is a complex part of our profession. It's unbelievable. Assessment and evaluation, these are the crown jewels of our university programs. And we don't treat them very well. And we don't support, in fact, our staff. Secondly, thank you for the learning analytics explanation. We need a monitoring and a real critical assessment of the quality of the current approaches. And don't forget this. We have rules and regulations in universities. And for instance, if we wanted to, when we wanted to introduce peer and self-assessment, we really looked at our rules and regulation at university level, whether they allow us to introduce this at university level. So these were 4 examples to exemplify, in fact, what we, in fact, derive from the evidence-based literature, and what we, in fact, to, well, prove or support is that the innovation of the measurement and the valuing part is really possible. You have really to look at the why, how, and who is responsible. Assessment of foundation knowledge, don't throw it away. It remains key, but please don't forget that complex competences assessment is really critical, and that you need research evidence to, in fact, ground these approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Babka. As it is more difficult to maintain sustained attention behind your screen than at an on-site event, I suggest that we now take a very short 2 minutes break to allow everyone to stretch their legs. So see you in 2 minutes for the rest of the program. Thank you. So we resume with the 3rd background address, which will be presented by Professor Isabelle Durand, who, as the Pro-Rector of Education and Training at UC Louvain, had to supervise the many adaptations to at-distance assessment in the various faculties. She entitled her communication Fair Exams in a Mass University, also a collective and institutional issue. Professor Durand, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues and dear friends. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the forum for giving me the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I don't have the expertise of my colleagues, of the colleagues who have spoken just before me. Nevertheless, the organizers thought that it might be interesting to hear a very different point of view, a more institutional point of view this afternoon on assessment in general in higher education. So, questioning the evaluation process is an ongoing process in each educational institution, in each university or in each school. And in the recent years, it seems that this questioning focused especially on two themes or on two questions. First question, how can we evaluate students properly when the number of students is constantly increasing and the number of teachers is not increasing? And second themes, many people wonder whether technological devices can usefully support the evaluation process. And in this regard, it's not necessary to recall to everybody that technologies made a massive irruption when it was a question of organizing the exams in June 2020. In my position of Prorector for Teaching and Learning, I would like to offer you some remarks on evaluation. I will proceed in two stages. First, I will allow myself a brief look back at the 2 years affected by the pandemic. And then, based on this recent experience, I will make some observations on our theme for today for stimulating debate. First, a brief look back at the pandemic years. And to begin, let's have a look at the 2019-20 academic year. Everyone remembers it. The use of technology to evaluate students made an unexpected, smashing and massive entrance in June 2020, while the pandemic was raging and Belgium was in a lockdown situation. At the 2020 edition of the Ethics Forum, Mrs. Françoise Doc of the Louvain Learning Lab showed that the online teaching that took place from mid-March to mid-May 2020 should be called emergency remote teaching more than online and distance learning. The way in which the courses were maintained at the time had more to do with organizational adaptation under the pressure of health circumstances than with a planned pedagogical project. For unprepared teachers, it was above all a question of continuing to teach. This situation explains why, at least at the beginning, most teachers tried to do as before, but with a screen between them and the students. There was a screen between the teacher and the student, but it was more or less business as usual. As for the exams this time, the session of June 2020 will remain a historic one, since all the exams were done remotely, using several platforms or even just using email transmission of documents. The platforms allowed for both written and oral exams. The situation was much the same in September 2020. Also, there was a very small return to face-to-face at the time. Of course, prior to the pandemic, there were already distance assessment practices, but they were used quite sparingly. Works to be written and take-home exams have been practiced when the learning outcomes can be assessed in this way. In these two cases, the students are usually asked to provide a complex and personalized production. In June 2020, and this is an unprecedented fact, all the courses were evaluated at a distance, even though the learning outcomes had been set before the pandemic, and in the complete ignorance of what was going to happen. In this context, what Françoise Doc describes as for the courses can be transposed to the evaluation. The university found itself in a situation of emergency remote evaluation and not in a situation of planned remote evaluation consistent with the targeted learning outcomes. It was a matter of continuing to evaluate. Retrospectively, I would say that the exam session of June 2020 was an experience that had a massive impact on the entire university community. The logistics were colossal for several university services, including IT service and the faculty administration. Everyone was plunged into a form of unknown with the stress and anxiety that such a situation induces. Given the urgency, the teachers generally produced a questionnaire that was quite similar to what they usually did, in particular so as not to disrupt the students even more. And they sometimes hoped that the technology would guarantee the reproduction of the usual examination condition, which was not the case. In practice, it turned out that no platform was able to reproduce the usual conditions. By this, I mean a student answering a questionnaire alone, without interaction, without other people, or without having access to textbooks. We then saw the development of countermeasures, such as a setting of response time, as you know. Now, what happened in the 2021 academic year? During the 2021 academic year, many courses were still held remotely. There was only an exception for the practical exercises. On the other hand, thanks to a relaxation of the rules applicable in higher education in the French community, the exams could be organized on campus. And what was observed immediately, there was a significant return to on-campus evaluation, even if the duration of the examination was shorter, and most often without any particular technology. This situation has continued into this year, the year 21-22. Does this mean that new technologies are unsuitable for assessment? Certainly not. And we can learn from the COVID experience as well. Given this recent experience, I would like to make now some remarks, some observations on our theme for today. I have identified 3 angles for reflections. The first reflection consists in clarifying the used concept. The assessment experience during the COVID crisis has intimately linked in some minds, not for everybody, but in some minds, distance evaluation and the use of platform. Remote testing, evaluation platforms and exam monitoring or proctoring have been linked by some people, but obviously they are not the same thing, not at all. You can indeed do remote assessment without technology, without specific platform. For example, when a student is asked to produce an essay, it's a kind of remote evaluation. Of course, most likely the student will use digitalized documentary resources or word processing software, but these are not evaluation on platforms. Conversely, the teacher can do on-campus assessment by having the student connected to a platform via a computer, a university computer, or his or her personal computer. In this case, the students are in a room at the university in the presence of a teacher, and they connect to a platform to make the exam. For example, they can use Moodle platform. One can imagine that the exam takes the form of a multiple choice questionnaire, and that the student does not answer on a paper sheet, on a paper document, but answers directly by connecting to a platform. This technique facilitates greatly the logistics surrounding the exam, which is useful for large groups of students. I think it's useful to keep this distinction in mind, the distinction between remote assessment and the use of technologies. Second reflection consists in reiterating the need for the teacher to link the assessment methods and the technological tool used when a tool is used. It's a fact that among the possible assessment methods, proctored or monitored individual written exam occupy a significant part of the assessment methods. During the COVID crisis, the university was able to collect a lot of data on how assessments are organized, and it turns out that this method of assessment, written exam, proctored written exams, remains a dominant method. And that was the problem in June and in September 2020. Today, there is no technology tool that allows for such an assessment to be properly done remotely. There is no possible linkage of a technological tool to the assessment methods of the proctored individual written exam. To put it simply, the issue of monitored distance learning is not properly resolved today, except at an exorbitant cost, probably. However, it is essential for the teacher to link the assessment method and the technical tool he is using. On the other hand, assistance in the organization of evaluations by means of special platforms such as Moodle is possible if the exam takes place on campus. A third reflection is that several things are already being done concretely to ensure quality assessment, even in the presence of a large group of students. In my university, we have been working on two axes over the last few years. First of all, an in-depth reflection has been carried out on multiple choice questionnaires. And I think that my colleague, Émilie Malcourant, is here present today with us. She knows very well this team, and she was very helpful in this reflection in my university over the last years. Of course, the multiple choice questionnaires are not a panacea. A variety in assessment method is still necessary. Nevertheless, when it comes to an evaluation method adapted to the abilities being evaluated, this technique of multiple choice questionnaire remains possible, but guidelines have been adopted to improve the quality of the questionnaires. And to ensure that these guidelines don't go unheeded, assistance to teachers is provided in three ways. The teacher can receive pedagogical help to design a quality multiple choice questionnaire. The teacher receives logistical support for the optical reading, and the teacher also receives support in statistical analysis. And for some time now, we have also removed the negative points. The student should not be stressed about answering a question. On the contrary, they should be encouraged to show what they have learned. A second line of thinking is to experiment with assessment softwares. Of course, no softwares can meet all expectations, but teachers can nevertheless be helped in correction tasks. And two tools are being used on an experimental basis at UC Louvain. First of all, Gradescope is a software to help in the correction of open-ended exam questions and written work. This software also offers an optical reading and automated correction module for multiple choice questionnaires. The students answers online or on paper sheet, which is then scanned, and the teacher can introduce correction criteria, which generates a sorting of the papers by similarity. And the correction process is accelerated and objectified. The role of the teacher remains crucial, but he is helped in his or in her work. Even without introducing correction criteria, the system facilitates the work of the teachers because it allows simultaneous correction by several teachers, 2 or 3 teachers, and it facilitates the consultation of the copies after the exam. Another software is the Comproved software, which I think is also used at the University of Antwerp and also in the University of Ghent, in the Ghent University. It's a peer review tool based on comparison. And my colleague Jean-François Rees, who is also here this afternoon, is sometimes using this software, and he would like probably, if he would like to add something to what I will say in the follow discussion, he will be able to share his experience of the using of this software. Students compare pairs of papers without having to give a grade, and the software then proposes a ranking of the work based on all the comparisons, and the final grade is given by the teacher, only by the teacher, not by the student. This tool is well suited for formative assessment, at least. So these comments were some few ideas I wanted to share with you this afternoon. And I thank you everybody for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Durand. You mentioned the names of a few colleagues, and it's funny, I just planned to give the floor for up to 5 minutes maximum to one participant who, when registering, told us about an interesting initiative to replace multiple choice questionnaire. And this is precisely Professor Jean-François Rees, who you mentioned. So Professor Rees, it's up to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. I would like to share my screen. That will be easy because I have prepared a small PowerPoint. Let me check where I could find this keynote. Hopefully it will work. I don't know. Sorry about this.